Why did no one look up when she entered the briefing room? And why did that silence sting more than any wound she'd carried out of a battlefield? She paused near the doorway, the dim fluorescent lights humming overhead, the air thick with conversations she wasn't invited into. They talked around her, past her, through her. A woman with a trembling left hand, a faded uniform, and a history written in reports no one here would ever see. She pretended it didn't matter. Pretended the distance was something she'd chosen. But beneath the calm exterior, something deeper churned, a quiet ache born from years of standing close enough to be useful, but never close enough to truly belong. They said she'd been sent to the armory because she was better with tools than with people. A convenient story, easier to repeat than the truth. Maya Santos worked in silence. Each weapon she inspected carried memories others would never understand. Screws tightened with caution, barrels aligned with care. Her hands paused only when a sudden sound startled her, not visibly, just enough that she noticed it inside herself. There were nights when the past returned uninvited. The dust, the smoke, the distant noise that didn't sound dangerous until it was too late. She pushed those images back, one breath at a time. But there was something she hadn't told them, not yet. The young sniper across the room watched her with a smirk, masking insecurity with loud confidence. He didn't know why the captain spoke to her with a tone others reserved for veterans who'd carried more than their share. He didn't see the way she measured every step, or the way she resisted the temptation to explain herself. She didn't need to be understood. Not anymore. Still, when he joked at her expense, when the room laughed, when the weight of memory pressed against the scarred map of her past, the question returned like a whisper. How much of herself had she buried, just to keep moving? And why, tonight of all nights, did the air feel like a warning? What made her hesitate at the doorway that evening? And why did the captain watch her like he already knew the answer? His voice softened when he spoke her name, and for a moment, the armory no longer felt like exile. It felt like a place where someone finally recognized the truth beneath the quiet. He'd read parts of her record, the pieces that hadn't been erased. He knew she hadn't always lived in the shadows. Maya studied the mission map long before anyone asked her opinion. The terrain, the ridgelines, the suspiciously perfect intelligence. She saw patterns no one else saw because she'd lived through them before. Places designed not to trap the enemy, but to swallow the very people sent to investigate them. And yet she said nothing. Not right away. She learned the hard way that warnings sometimes sounded like doubt to those who'd never failed before. So she kept working, kept breathing through the tension in her chest, kept telling herself that tonight would be different. But the echoes of another mission wouldn't leave her. Another valley, another team, another moment where certainty cracked into helplessness. She didn't speak about the scars on her forearm, the ones etched into patterns she carried like a map of regret. She didn't talk about the hours no one counted, the choices no one saw, the seconds that arrived too late. Instead, she focused on the rifles in front of her, on the young operator who didn't yet understand fear, on the weight of responsibility that never really faded. And when he mocked her again, half joking, half cruel, she didn't respond with anger. She responded with truth, soft, controlled, honest in a way that felt heavier than any confrontation. His expression shifted. The room grew quiet. And still, she said less than she could have. Because the real burden couldn't be spoken aloud. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the base grew quieter, she stood alone by the equipment she wasn't officially assigned to use anymore. A rifle she hadn't touched in years. A familiar shape that belonged to another life. A life she'd walked away from because the cost of staying had become too heavy. Why then did she reach for it now? Why did her heart pound with the uneasy certainty that something was about to go wrong? And why, despite everything she'd lost, did she still feel responsible for those walking into danger? What did it feel like to return to a weapon you promised yourself you never use again? She rested it on her knee, not out of nostalgia, but out of reluctant acceptance. The kind that comes when you realize the world has quietly placed you back where you swore you'd never stand. The night wind brushed past the rocks as she climbed, her breath steady, measured, patient. Every step brought back memories she had hoped to leave buried beneath time. But she wasn't climbing for glory. She wasn't chasing redemption. She was simply refusing to let history repeat itself. As the valley opened below her, she saw it, the unnatural alignment of positions, the deliberate angles of fire. Not chance, not coincidence, intent. She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling old scars pulse beneath her sleeve. Her hands didn't shake now. Not here. Not when the world narrowed into distance, geometry, air, and silence. She could hear the distant radio traffic. The unease. The moment when confidence began to fracture. Their voices carried hints of doubt, the kind that comes when instinct whispers before logic catches up. For a brief second, she hesitated, not because she feared failure, but because she feared succeeding and becoming exactly what she'd tried so hard to stop being. Someone who saves others at the cost of herself. But there was no one else up here. No one who understood the terrain the way she did. No one who had stood in this same story before. So she settled into the rock. Exhaled. Waited. Not for the perfect shot, but for the right moment. She didn't think of heroics, or legacy, or payback. She thought of the young operator who'd mocked her, not out of malice, but out of innocence. Of the captain who saw the tremor in her hand and still trusted the steadiness of her mind. Of the teammates whose names she carried like quiet prayers. And of the simple, unspoken truth. Sometimes, the only way to heal old wounds is to make sure no one else receives them. But even here, even now, there was something she hadn't admitted to herself. Not yet. What happens when the shot you take isn't meant to end a life but to change the course of one? The night answered with a distant echo, a ripple through the valley that carried confusion instead of finality. She chose her targets carefully, not out of hesitation but out of intention. Equipment, angles, the psychology of uncertainty. She wasn't there to dominate. She was there to create time. Time for decisions to shift. Time for fear to unsettle over confidence. Time for hope to exist where moments earlier there had been none. Down below, voices shifted from panic to disbelief. The world didn't suddenly become safe, but it became survivable. And for the first time in a long while, Maya felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Purpose without pride. She knew the risks. She knew what revealing herself meant. Yet she stayed. Every breath a choice. Every pause a memory. She spoke over the radio with a steadiness that didn't reach her eyes. Because inside, conflict still lived, the part of her that wanted to disappear, forever battling the part that refused to walk away when others needed her. And when the path to escape revealed itself, when the team below realized they had a chance, when gratitude echoed through the airwaves, she didn't answer with thanks. She answered with distance, with direction, with responsibility. Because there was something more she needed to do, something that went beyond tactics or survival or even sacrifice. A final thread she needed to follow through to the end. Not out of guilt, not out of punishment, but out of quiet acceptance that some debts are not paid with recognition, only with resolve. Why did she move away from safety when others were finally headed toward it? The mountains stretched before her, and for a brief second she looked back, not at the team she'd helped save, but at the life she'd built in the shadows. The quiet room, the armory bench, the silence that had once felt like refuge and now felt like avoidance. She walked forward anyway, every step slower, heavier but not reluctant. Reflective. The chase that followed was not a legend, not a spectacle. It was simply a woman guiding danger away from those who had run out of luck. The night closed in. Fatigue settled deeper into her bones, but with every passing minute she felt something soften inside her, not relief, but peace. She had not run from who she was. Not this time. Hours later, long after the echo of movement faded from the ridgeline, the mountains held their silence like a secret. Stories would grow from what little was found. The world would try to name what they couldn't understand. But the truth lived quieter than any tale they'd tell. It lived in the armory where a young soldier now paused before speaking, in the way he checked his rifle with a reverence he'd never known before, in the way the captain stood alone, not mourning a loss, but honoring a life lived with dignity no report could ever capture. And somewhere, carried softly in the air, her presence lingered, not as a myth, not as a ghost, but as a reminder of something far more human. That courage is not loud. That resilience doesn't ask to be seen. That sometimes, the strongest people are the ones who choose to act when no one is watching, and accept that recognition was never the purpose. In the end, her story didn't shout. It breathed. It waited. It lived quietly inside those who understood that real strength isn't measured in distance, or precision, or impossible moments, but in the grace of a single, unspoken truth. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the room suddenly feel colder when she stopped speaking, and why did no one seem able to meet her eyes afterward? The silence that followed her confession wasn't judgmental, it was heavy, uncertain. The kind of silence that happens when reality lands harder than anyone expected. The young sniper who had mocked her earlier stood frozen, his confidence stripped away, his expression shifting into something unfamiliar. Respect mixed with guilt. Maya didn't enjoy that reaction. She didn't want pity. She didn't want awe. She didn't even want understanding. She simply wanted the truth laid bare, so that he, and maybe everyone else in that armory, would think twice before assuming quiet meant weakness. Still, as she lowered her sleeve and turned away, a question lingered in her mind, soft and unwelcome. Had she said too much or not enough? She walked through the corridor beside Captain Davis, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, the floor echoing under their boots. The base felt different at night, emptier, more reflective, as if the walls themselves held memories too heavy to speak aloud. The captain kept glancing at her, his expression careful, thoughtful, not probing, not intrusive, simply aware. "You didn't have to tell him that," he finally said. Her answer came without hesitation. "No, but if he walks into that valley tonight thinking he's untouchable, he might not walk out." Davis slowed, as if the truth in her words carried weight he hadn't fully considered. For a moment, he wasn't a commanding officer. He was just a man responsible for people he knew he could not always protect. He'd seen too many return quiet, and too many not return at all. Maya knew that feeling better than most. There was something else she could have said, something resting at the edge of memory, the sound of sand shifting under boots, the echo of voices on a radio that never received an answer. But some stories didn't fit into sentences. Some stayed locked behind small gestures, stiff breaths, and scars carved into skin. They exited into the cool night air. The base generators rumbled in the distance, a sound as constant as heartbeat. Beyond the perimeter lights, darkness stretched into the mountains, deep, quiet, indifferent. It was a landscape that forgot quickly, but never forgave easily. And as Maya looked toward it, she felt something familiar rise inside her. Not fear, not dread, recognition. The mission brief replayed in her mind, the terrain maps, the high ground positions, the flawless intelligence packet that looked less like information and more like bait. Everything about it whispered the same warning she'd ignored once before. She had learned from that mistake. The hard way. She should have walked away then, should have returned to the armory, to the quiet corner where unfinished rifles waited for her hands. A reasonable person would have done that. A self-protective person definitely would have. But she stood there instead, still, listening. The night wind brushed across her cheek, carrying the faint metallic smell of desert air. Somewhere, engines warmed for departure. Somewhere, laughter softened into anxious silence as operators checked gear one last time. And beneath all of it, a question pressed deeper into her thoughts. Was she standing here because of responsibility, or because she didn't know who she was without it? She followed the captain into his office, the low light falling across stacks of reports and redacted pages. He closed the door gently, not out of secrecy, but out of respect. On his desk lay a tablet with the mission route displayed in glowing lines. She didn't sit. She didn't need to. Her eyes moved across the map, tracing terrain features others might overlook. Narrow passes that offered perfect fire lanes, ridges that created blind angles, routes that looked safe until the last possible second. It mirrored the same design she had once walked into, the same pattern that had rewritten her life. Her jaw tightened, not out of anger but out of something quieter, something heavier. Regret wrapped in clarity. The past wasn't haunting her, it was repeating itself. And this time, she refused to be a spectator. Davis watched her study the screen, his expression hinting at an unspoken question. "How sure are you?" he asked softly. Maya hesitated, not because she doubted her instincts, but because she understood the cost of certainty. If she spoke, she would step back into a world she'd spent years trying to leave. "I've seen this before," she said quietly, "right before everything went wrong." He didn't press further. He didn't need to. Some statements don't ask for proof, they simply carry truth. There was conflict in her chest, a quiet, internal war between the part of her that wanted to stay invisible and the part of her that remembered what it felt like to lose people you cared about, knowing deep down that you might have seen it coming. She drew in a slow breath. "Give me access to the long-range comms array," she said, "and whatever monitoring feeds you're authorized to patch through." He nodded, not with authority but with trust. It had been a long time since anyone trusted her judgment this way. And the realization hurt more than she expected. The room felt smaller as she turned to leave, the weight of the decision settling quietly over her shoulders. She wasn't returning to the armory tonight. She wasn't stepping back into routine. She was stepping toward the one place she'd promised herself she would never return to. A position where someone else's survival depended on her. On her patience, on her restraint, on her willingness to carry the burden again. Walking through the dim corridor, she passed soldiers who barely noticed her presence. They moved quickly, energized, focused, unaware of the storm gathering beyond the perimeter fence. A few nodded. Most didn't look up. She didn't blame them. People rarely saw what didn't introduce itself loudly. She slipped into a forgotten corner of the communications building, a space cluttered with aging systems and wires that hummed with unseen signals. It smelled like dust and metal and history. Her fingers hovered over controls she hadn't touched in years, yet somehow still remembered. The room felt too bright, too still. And then she opened the hard case. For a moment she didn't breathe. The rifle inside wasn't a relic or a weapon, it was a memory she could hold. The notches carved into the stock weren't triumphs. They weren't kills. They were names she no longer spoke aloud. Names carved gently enough to avoid splintering the wood, but hard enough that the knife had cut skin when her hand slipped. She rested her palm over them. Not in grief. Not in torment. In remembrance. Her left hand trembled not with fear, but with the echo of a body that had lived too long in readiness. Years of tension didn't fade easily. They didn't fade at all, really. They simply went quiet until called upon again. She closed the case. Not out of hesitation, but because the decision had already been made. Outside, rotors thundered into motion somewhere in the distance. Radios crackled to life across the room, threads of conversation weaving through static. She recognized the tone in their voices, disciplined, confident, unaware of the invisible teeth waiting in the dark. Maya stared at the comms array. Listened. Waited. The mission clock ticked forward. And beneath the structured cadence of radio check-ins, she heard something else. A pause. A hesitation. A sound only people who'd been ambushed before recognized. The subtle shift in communication rhythm right before certainty collapses. Her pulse steadied. Not faster. Calmer. She leaned closer to the microphone. Then stopped. Because there was something she hadn't admitted yet. Not to the captain, not to the young sniper, not even to herself. This wasn't just about saving them. It was about facing the part of her life she tried so hard to bury under silence. The part that still believed she owed something to the people she could not save. She exhaled slowly. And for the first time in years, she chose not to run from that feeling. Not this time. Why did the night suddenly feel thinner, as if the air itself was holding its breath while she reached for the radio? Her fingers hovered an inch above the switch, frozen between instinct and hesitation. Outside, the mountains stretched into darkness, jagged silhouettes against a sky scattered with distant, indifferent stars. Somewhere beyond those ridgelines, voices moved through the valley, confident, focused, unaware. She could almost see them in her mind, careful steps over loose stone, quick glances at high ground, breath steady but shallow. Soldiers walking into a place that had been designed not to test them, but to trap them. Her heart didn't race. It quieted, like it always did when the world narrowed into choices that mattered. There was a time when that calm had frightened her, when she wondered what it meant that danger brought her clarity instead of panic. But years of silence had softened the fear. It no longer felt like detachment. It felt like responsibility. The static on the comms shifted. A pause, barely noticeable to anyone else, but unmistakable to someone who had once lived through that same hesitation just seconds before everything went wrong. A memory moved through her chest like a faint echo. Dust. Heat. A voice rising on the radio with a tone that sounded almost like confusion before turning into something else entirely. She closed her eyes. Just for a moment. Not to escape the past, but to meet it. Then she switched the channel open. Her voice didn't sound like command. It sounded like steadiness. Measured, controlled, almost gentle. She didn't introduce herself. Didn't claim authority. Didn't ask for trust. She simply spoke as someone who understood what the silence meant, someone who knew when certainty became too smooth, too coordinated, too perfect to be real. And as she transmitted, she felt something inside her loosen, not relief, but acceptance, because saying nothing would have been easier, safer, quieter. But silence had cost too much once before, and she refused to let it happen again. Her words weren't dramatic. They weren't heroic. They were careful, thoughtful, precise. A warning wrapped inside reassurance. A suggestion disguised as observation. A voice that didn't demand obedience, only attention. Down in the valley, the response came slowly, like a thought forming in real time. The team leader spoke calmly, his tone respectful, curious, cautious. He didn't question her presence, didn't ask who she was or why she was up there. He simply listened. And in that small space of trust, the mission shifted. Maya watched the monitors in front of her, scattered fragments of thermal imagery and telemetry feeds, creating a story only experience could interpret. The terrain lit up in familiar patterns, elevation changes, field coverage angles, choke points disguised as escape routes. She recognized the trap, not because of how obvious it was, but because of how subtle. Everything in that valley had been placed with intention. Someone had studied movement, behavior, human nature, and counted on confidence to do the rest. Her jaw tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. The people who built this ambush hadn't been improvising. They understood patience. They understood timing. They understood what it meant to wait for others to believe they were safe before closing the distance around them. She had once underestimated enemies like that. She never did again. Her hand rested on the desk beside the radio, steady now. The tremor in her wrist faded beneath focus, replaced by the kind of calm that came only when the mind stopped resisting what it already knew it was born to do. But even in that clarity, another feeling lived beneath the surface. Not fear, not pain, something quieter. The awareness that every choice tonight was also a conversation with who she used to be. The version of herself who once believed skill could protect everyone. The version who learned brutally that sometimes it isn't enough. She leaned closer to the microphone, guiding adjustments, not orders, not commands, just shifts in trajectory, a few degrees here, a pause there, a moment of stillness before movement. Little changes that stretched time and reshaped risk. Every second mattered, but she refused to rush them, because rushing meant acting from fear, and fear made people forget to think. She listened to the team's breathing patterns over the radio, to the subtle differences in tone when they whispered, to the way uncertainty spread not as panic but as awareness. Awareness was good. Awareness changed outcomes. Someone in the background muttered half-audibly, a quiet expression of doubt, the kind that comes when instinct collides with training. She heard the vulnerability in it, and the pride he tried to swallow afterward. She almost smiled. Not at him. At the memory of herself, a younger woman once too stubborn to admit when something didn't feel right. The map shifted. Movement on a ridge. Subtle. Calculated. Her pulse steadied further. The enemy didn't know she was there yet, but they would. It was only a matter of time. They had planned this too carefully to assume they were unseen, and when they realized precision shots were being made from somewhere beyond their reach, they would search for the source. They always did. And that was the part she hadn't spoken aloud. Not even to the captain. Because the truth wasn't dramatic. It wasn't tragic. It was simply real. Helping them meant becoming visible. Becoming visible meant becoming the focus. And becoming the focus meant choosing, knowingly, to carry a risk that didn't belong to anyone else. The internal conflict rose again, familiar, heavy, honest. How many times had she promised herself she was done making that choice? How many times had she convinced herself that silence was self-preservation instead of avoidance? Yet here she was, not dragged back into this life, not forced, standing in it willingly, not because she craved purpose, not because she needed redemption, but because there was still a part of her that could not walk away when she saw danger forming, even from a distance, even in shadows, even when no one would ever know she had been there at all. The first distant echo of gunfire crackled through the channel. Not frantic, controlled, measured bursts. Contact. Her breath exhaled slowly, as if her body had been waiting for that moment to commit fully. She reached for the rifle case, not with aggression, but with respect. She opened it again, rested her hand against the cold metal, felt the quiet weight of it. The notches along the stock pressed lightly against her palm. People once called marks like those reminders. To her, they were promises not of revenge, but of responsibility, boundaries she had carved into wood so she would never forget what loss had taught her. She didn't whisper to it. didn't treat it like legend. It wasn't mythic. It was simply a tool, one she had spent years avoiding, one she now returned to, not with pride, but with gravity. The decision was already made. She lifted the rifle. Not hurried, not dramatic, just certain. And as she turned toward the door, toward the mountains waiting beyond the base, a thought passed gently through her mind. Not a memory, not a regret, a question. If she survived tonight, what would be left for her afterward? Would she return to quiet rooms where no one spoke her name? Would she disappear again into silence? Or would this finally be the moment where she stopped pretending distance was the same thing as peace? She didn't know. And for once, she allowed herself not to. She stepped outside. The night met her with open, endless stillness, shadows stretched across stone, wind brushing past forgotten pathways. The sky above felt impossibly wide, like a witness that refused to intervene. She adjusted the strap across her shoulder, took one steady breath, and began climbing. Not to chase glory, not to chase memory, but to meet whatever waited for her in that valley, with the quiet resolve of someone who understood that sometimes the hardest battles aren't fought against enemies, but against the parts of ourselves we've spent years trying not to face. Why did the mountain feel quieter the higher she climbed, as if even the wind understood what she was walking toward? Each step pressed gently into loose stone, the crunch barely audible beneath the distant pulse of gunfire echoing through the valley below. She didn't rush. She didn't slow. She simply moved, steady, deliberate, like someone who knew that hesitation and urgency could both be dangerous when carried in the wrong measure. Her breath formed small clouds in the cold night air. Her shoulders ached. Her left wrist throbbed beneath the wrap. But none of it mattered, because something else filled her now, not adrenaline, not excitement, not fear, but a quiet sense of alignment. As if, for the first time in years, every thread of memory, regret, discipline, and instinct had woven themselves into a single purpose. Still, a question followed her with every step. Was she climbing toward the mission? Or toward herself? The ridge opened slowly ahead of her, a break in the rock that looked ordinary to anyone passing by, but to her eyes, it was a natural vantage point carved by time, a place the world had built for patience. She lowered herself carefully, letting the stone meet her body like an old companion. The valley spread out below, shadows shifting, heat signatures flickering through darkness. She watched the pattern unfold, not as a spectator, but as someone who understood how fragile moments like these were. Down in the ravine, movement tightened, positions adjusting, angles narrowing, a rhythm forming that felt too controlled to be chance. The team below still fought with discipline and composure, but the terrain itself was against them. They didn't know it yet. Or maybe they were starting to. Maya steadied the rifle against the stone. Her cheek rested lightly against the stock, not pressing, just touching, the way you might lean into a memory you're not sure you're ready to revisit. The world inside the scope narrowed into distance, air, gravity, and fragile opportunity. Her heart didn't pound. It listened. She didn't look for enemies first. She looked for patterns. Who commanded movement? Who hesitated? Who others watched before they acted? Because shots weren't decisions made in isolation. They were conversations with consequence. Her hand hovered at the trigger, and something unspoken rose in her chest. Not doubt, but humility. Even here, even now, she knew nothing was guaranteed. Not survival, not success, not absolution. She wasn't here to rewrite the past. She wasn't here to erase mistakes. She was here to do the one thing she had always done when everything else fell apart. Stay calm, long enough for someone else to live. The radio crackled faintly in her ear. Breathing. Stones sliding under boots. A voice whispering directions with steady tension, not fear, not panic, just awareness tightening into resolve. She listened without interrupting, without asserting control, without announcing herself. Trust wasn't something you demanded in a moment like this. It was something you earned in silence. Then something shifted in the rhythm of gunfire. Not louder, not closer, sharper, coordinated. Three angles locking in at once. The same design she had seen in diagrams after missions were reviewed. The same geometry that punished movement disguised as escape. Her jaw tightened, grief and calculation meeting in the same breath. This was the moment she had lived through once before. And this time, she refused to watch it break someone else. She inhaled slowly. Her crosshairs didn't rest on a body. They rested on a junction of metal and timing, the one mechanism holding control over the valley's panic. The wind tugged gently across the ridge. Humidity softened the air. Distance stretched into something heavy and fragile. She waited, not for the shot, for the intention behind it. Her finger tightened, not with aggression but with care. The rifle pulsed. The night echoed. Down below, confusion cracked through command. Not chaos, not destruction. Doubt. A pause in the enemy's confidence that spread faster than fear. She didn't celebrate, didn't flinch, didn't breathe for a moment. The team below didn't know who she was, but they felt what she'd done. The valley's danger shifted by a fraction, and sometimes a fraction was all it took to turn inevitability into possibility. A voice broke through the static. Grateful, strained, searching. She didn't answer with identity. She answered with direction, measured, sparse, supportive. Her tone didn't claim authority, it accompanied theirs. She wasn't here to control the mission, only to widen the narrow path through which survival now had a chance to pass. But even as she guided movement, another realization pressed gently into her thoughts. The farther they moved toward safety, the closer danger moved toward her. She saw the enemy reposition, saw angles harden, saw behavior change from pursuit to hunt. They were no longer firing blindly. They were searching. For her, a familiar, restless ache settled into her chest. Not regret, but acknowledgement. This was always the cost. Every life she helped move away from danger drew danger toward her in return, not as punishment, but as balance. And she had known that before she ever climbed this ridge. Still, when she saw their formation shifting in her direction, a small question whispered inside her. Was this worth it? Her answer arrived before the thought finished forming. Yes. Not loudly. Not defiantly. Just certain. She adjusted position not to hide but to buy more time before they found the source of the shots. The wind changed. Temperature shifted. Her muscles ached from stillness. A tension crept slowly into her wrist, but she refused to rush. Rushing was what turned certainty into mistakes. And mistakes. She had lived with mistakes already. The second shot came later, not in haste, but in grace. Another fragile moment nudged just far enough away from disaster to matter. She didn't look at the target afterward. She didn't need to. The silence that followed said enough. Below, movement changed. Hope didn't sound loud. It sounded like breathing that didn't strain as hard. Like footsteps that didn't hesitate as long. Like voices that softened not with relief, but with gratitude unspoken. Someone murmured, "Whoever that is, keep going." Her throat tightened. Just slightly. Not from pride. From something gentler. The soft ache of being useful again in a way she wished didn't still matter so much. Because usefulness and identity had once become the same thing for her. and losing one had felt like losing both. Another ridge in the distance flickered with heat signatures. Enemy reinforcement. Vaster, more disciplined, more aware than before. They didn't panic when their positions weakened, they adapted, they split, they pursued and circled simultaneously. Their choices revealed something important. They weren't just chasing the team. They were bracketing the source. Sorry. She didn't curse, didn't resent it, didn't hesitate. She made a quiet decision, one she didn't announce, one no one asked of her, one that felt less like sacrifice and more like responsibility meeting acceptance. If they followed her, they wouldn't follow them. The thought wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fatalistic. It was simply true. She transmitted one last directional call, a small adjustment that would close the last gap the team needed to cross out of the valley's teeth. Her voice didn't waver. Her tone didn't harden. She spoke with the softness of someone who had already made peace with the path ahead. A pause lingered afterward, a silence that felt almost like recognition from the man on the other end of the line. Whoever you are. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Gratitude rarely requires completion. She lowered the transmitter, looked out over the valley, and for the first time tonight, she allowed herself to feel something other than focus. Not fear, not sorrow, something like quiet and fragile hope, not for herself, but for the simple, human possibility that someone would walk away from tonight with a deeper respect for life than the one they'd walked in with. She shifted deeper into the rocks, listened to the footsteps approaching from the ridge behind her. Not panicked, not rushed, just steady. She exhaled, not in resignation, in acceptance. And in that stillness, one truth settled inside her with clarity she had spent years running from. She wasn't here because she couldn't escape her past. She was here because she had finally stopped trying to. Why did the footsteps behind her sound different from the others, heavier, more deliberate, almost patient? She didn't turn right away. She didn't need to. The rhythm of movement told her everything. These weren't men chasing blindly through fear. These were fighters who understood terrain, who understood silence, who understood that sometimes the most dangerous enemy wasn't the one shooting, but the one who waited. The wind shifted along the ridge, carrying dust across the stone. The mountains whispered with a stillness that felt ancient, indifferent. She pressed her shoulder deeper into the rock, feeling its cold texture against her skin, and for a moment she wondered whether this place had seen countless stories like hers, people who stepped quietly into danger because someone else needed a little more time. She didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't rush. The distance between pursuit and contact was closing, but she knew that time stretched differently in moments like this. Seconds felt longer, choices felt heavier, and the silence carried a weight that felt almost compassionate. Down in the valley, the team's footsteps faded toward safer ground. Their radio transmissions grew softer, less frantic, less constrained. Hope moved through their voices like oxygen. She closed her eyes briefly, not to escape, but to steady the rising ache in her chest. Relief and tension lived side by side inside her, because even as their chances grew stronger, hers grew smaller. And yet, she felt calm, not brave, not heroic, just at peace with what her presence here meant. The enemy crept closer along the ridge, spreading out carefully, tracing the line of rock she had chosen. Their patience mirrored her own. Their discipline almost impressed her, or perhaps, in a strange way, she respected it. War didn't erase humanity, it complicated it. These weren't shadows. They were people following duty and belief in survival just as she was. She understood that paradox too well. Her rifle rested beside her, no longer a symbol, just a tool of precision and restraint. She could have fired. She could have ended the closest threat. But every bullet carried consequence, sound, visibility, trajectory, and she chose her moments not for dominance, but for meaning. Not everything needed to be answered with force. Sometimes the greatest act of strength was patience. Her thoughts drifted not as distraction, but as memory unfolding gently in the pauses between breaths. She remembered the day she left her old unit. The hallway felt endless. The fluorescent lights hummed like an unspoken farewell. People shook her hand, thanked her for service, told her she'd done enough. But they didn't see the part of her that stayed behind. The part that didn't leave when she walked away. The part that kept replaying a moment in dust and heat and silence. A moment where she wished time had stretched just a little longer, the way it did tonight. Her hand brushed over the notches in the rifle stock. Not regret. Not grief. Just remembrance. A faint sound snapped her attention back, a small shift of gravel behind the nearest boulder. Close now. Closer than she would normally allow anyone to come. Yet she remained still. Listening. Measuring. The first figure appeared in silhouette, cautious posture, rifle angled low, eyes scanning not for a target, but for understanding. He paused, breath visible in the cold. For a strange, brief second, their stillness mirrored one another. Two people separated by thought, training, purpose, yet sharing the same fragile thread of silence. He didn't see her. Not yet. And in that pause, she felt an unexpected sensation. Empathy. Because he, too, had likely lost people. He, too, had probably carried names inside his chest, the way she carried hers. He wasn't her enemy by nature, just by circumstance. Footsteps spread wider across the ridge, another fighter moving to flank, another behind her. Their strategy was careful, methodical, almost eerily familiar. They were doing exactly what she would have done. Which meant they were close to finding her. The radio in her ear crackled softly. A voice from the team, breathless, relieved, on the move. Still alive. Still going. Her lips parted slightly, not to respond, but to steady herself. That was enough. That was the reason. That was the choice. She shifted at last, not dramatically, not desperately, just enough to guide attention away from the path the team had taken. A deliberate scrape of stone, a sound placed where instinct would follow. The nearest fighter snapped toward the noise. Movement tightened. Angles shifted. The pattern changed. Away from escape. Toward her. She accepted it. Not as sacrifice. Not as martyrdom. As responsibility willingly carried. The world inside the ridge slowed. Her pulse didn't race. It softened. For a moment she wondered. If she disappeared into these mountains tonight, would anyone remember her for who she truly was? Not as a myth, not as a story whispered across radios, but as a quiet woman who showed up where she was needed, even when it cost her more than anyone would ever see. Would the young sniper remember the way she looked at him, not with anger but with honesty? Would the captain remember that she never asked for recognition, only purpose? Would anyone remember her name? Or was that never the point? The enemy closed in. 10 meters now. Maybe less. One heartbeat. Then another. She inhaled slowly, feeling the night settle deep into her lungs, feeling the fragile beauty of the moment, not in triumph, but in acceptance that every life at some point arrives at a place where choice and identity finally meet. She didn't regret climbing this ridge. She didn't resent the silence she had lived in. She didn't fear what came next. Because for the first time in years, she felt whole. Not broken. Not forgotten, not unfinished, just complete in the simple truth that she had lived consistently, with the value she had always believed mattered most. Protect others, even when no one sees you doing it. Her finger brushed the rifle's frame, not to fire, but to ground herself in the reality of the present. A stone rolled near her boot. The final step, the moment before discovery. And still some part of her wondered, softly, if she had one more chance to choose differently. Would she? Her answer rose quietly inside her. No. This was always who she was. The wind swept across the ridge. The mountain exhaled with her. And the night, fragile, suspended, unspoken, held its breath. As the last few seconds of distance vanished between hunter and guardian, and the path ahead narrowed into whatever fate the moment was about to reveal. Why did time feel as if it slowed to a fragile whisper in that final breath before they saw her, as though the mountain itself wanted to delay what came next? The world around her narrowed, not into fear, not into danger, but into presence. The sound of distant wind, the faint rustle of fabric, the quiet rhythm of another human being stepping into her line of existence. The first fighter's silhouette broke the edge of the rock. He saw her, not as a legend, not as a threat, just as a person. For the briefest instant, neither of them moved. Their eyes met across the small divide of stone and shadow, and in that connection lived something deeply human. Not hatred, not rage, just two lives carrying different histories into the same silent moment. He hesitated. The others behind him shifted. Uncertainty rippled through them, not fear, but recognition that the person they'd hunted wasn't a phantom or a monster, but a quiet woman with tired eyes and steady breath. Maya didn't reach for the trigger. She didn't lunge. She didn't speak. She simply looked at him, calmly, steadily, as though asking a question he might not have words for. Is this really what either of us wants? For a heartbeat, the world felt suspended. Then movement fractured the stillness. Not violent, not chaotic, just inevitable. She shifted away from the ridge, drawing attention farther from the valley below, guiding pursuit downhill along a path that curved away from the team's escape route. Their focus followed. The tension moved with her, drawn not by force, but by intent. Every step she took was a choice. Every pause, a conversation with herself. She didn't run. She didn't surrender. She simply continued leading danger away, the same way she had guided hope towards safety minutes earlier. The mountain path narrowed into worn stone and low brush. The ground dipped. The sky above widened into cold blue-black. Footsteps echoed behind her, determined, cautious, alive. They were no longer chasing an unknown threat. They were following a person who had chosen to be found. And strangely, that realization softened something inside her. Not relief, not resignation, a lingering sense of grace. Because she had not come here seeking redemption. She had come here offering time. Time for strangers who would never know her name. Time for a boy in an armory who might now walk into future missions with humility rather than arrogance. Time for a captain who would no longer question the instincts that kept him awake at night. Time for a team whose story would not end in a valley carved for ambush. She felt the ache in her legs, the fatigue settling across her shoulders, the tremor returning faintly to her wrist. Her body was honest about its limits. Her spirit remained steady. Another ridge rose ahead, jagged, weathered, a place the wind carved into quiet shelter. She paused in its shadow, listening to the rhythm of footsteps behind her. They slowed, drew closer, not eager, not reckless. Respectful. A strange stillness wrapped the moment like a question neither side could fully answer. What now? She didn't think of glory. She didn't think of legend. She thought of Rodriguez, Chun, Williams, of laughter in dusty rooms, of shared jokes before long missions, of 3 lives whose memories had taught her that strength wasn't about surviving every battle. It was about honoring the people who didn't. The footsteps stopped just beyond the rocks. Breathing filled the silence. Not angry, not triumphant, just human. She closed her eyes for a brief instant and let the mountain wind move across her face. It didn't feel like an ending. It didn't feel like defeat. It felt peaceful, because she understood something now that had taken years to accept. Her worth had never lived in medals or missions or impossible distances. It lived in the quiet choices no one saw, in the patience others mistook for weakness, in the compassion she carried into places where compassion rarely survived. A voice spoke behind her, low, uncertain, cautious. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. It wasn't a threat. It was acknowledgement, a simple recognition that whatever else they were in this moment, enemies, opposites, adversaries, they were also 2 souls bound by the same human fragility. For a second, she wished the world were different, that people on opposite sides of valleys and borders could meet without rifles between them, that lives like hers didn't have to be written in shadows and sacrifice. But she also understood something deeper. Some people are born with a quiet sense of duty that doesn't depend on recognition and doesn't disappear when history forgets their name. She took one final breath, slow, steady, grounded in acceptance rather than fear. Down in the distance, helicopter rotors thudded faintly through the air. Far away, safe, alive, a small, almost invisible smile softened her expression. Not pride, gratitude. The world did erupt. No grand spectacle, no dramatic crescendo, just the mountain holding its silence, and the night folding gently around her story. Hours later, as dawn brushed the horizon with muted light, a recovery team walked the same ridge she'd once climbed under darkness. They spoke little. They moved carefully. They read the ground the way soldiers read memory. They saw signs of struggle, but also signs of patience, discipline, deliberate movement that pulled danger away instead of toward others. They paused where the wind still carried a faint echo of presence, as if the mountain remembered her more clearly than any official report ever would. No one spoke for a long time, because some moments do not need commentary. They simply need silence. The captain stood alone at the overlook, hands folded behind his back, eyes tracing the same valley she'd watched from above. He didn't see a myth. He didn't see a ghost. He saw a woman who had lived with courage that didn't announce itself. A woman who never asked for acknowledgement, but left behind a legacy of restraint, compassion, and quiet strength. Behind him, the young sniper stood with his rifle lowered, posture humbled, gaze thoughtful. His voice, when it finally broke the silence, came out softer than the man who once mocked her. She didn't try to prove anything, he said quietly. She just did what needed to be done. The captain didn't answer right away, because he understood something the boy was only beginning to realize. True dignity rarely explains itself. It simply exists, and leaves others changed in its wake. He looked out across the mountains one last time, not searching for closure, but honoring the space where choice and character had met in a single, silent act. No monument would mark this ridge. No official story would capture its truth. But somewhere in the hearts of those who heard fragments of it, whispered across radios, passed in quiet rituals before missions, carried in the careful way rifles were handled from then on, Her presence lived on, not as legend, not as myth, but as a reminder that real strength isn't loud, that resilience doesn't always stand in the light, that the greatest acts of courage are often the ones witnessed by no one and remembered by everyone who learns from them. And in the soft echo of mountain wind, in the breath that lingers between memory and silence, her story rests with a final, unspoken truth. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts.